there's a photograph that shouldn't exist. It sits in a private collection in Philadelphia, never displayed, never discussed, showing 37 people standing in front of a barn somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. The photograph was taken in 1862, and every single person in it was supposed to be dead. Not figuratively dead, actually dead. Recorded as deceased in official documents across 3 southern states, death certificates filed, estates settled, mourning periods observed. Yet there they stand, alive, staring into a camera with expressions that seem to carry the weight of something unspeakable, something that defies every record, every law, every assumption about what was possible in America before the Civil War. The photograph was discovered in 1978 by a graduate student researching unrelated family histories. She spent 6 months trying to identify the people in it. When she finally did, when she matched their faces to names in antebellum records, she stopped her research entirely. She never published her findings. She never spoke about what she'd learned. She simply walked away from her doctorate and took a job teaching high school history in Vermont, where she remains to this day, refusing all interviews. But before she abandoned her work, she left a single note in the university archives, 3 words written in shaking handwriting: he was real. Who was real? That's the question that pulls us into one of the most disturbing, beautiful, and inexplicable stories in American history. A story about a man who arrived in Savannah, Georgia in 1850 with nothing but money and a secret. A man who spent 7 years executing a plan so elaborate, so precise, and so impossible that even now, more than a century and a half later, historians can't agree on whether it actually happened or whether we're all chasing a ghost. What we know for certain is this: between 1850 and 1857, 63 families disappeared from the records of the American South. 63 families, comprising 214 people, simply ceased to exist in every legal document, every census record, every plantation ledger. And at the center of every disappearance was the same man, a man who called himself William Thorne. A man who bought people, then made them vanish so completely that it was as if they'd never existed at all. This is his story, and it begins not with his arrival, but with his death. Or rather, with the discovery that he might never have died at all. The city of Savannah in the spring of 1850 was a place where fortunes were made on the backs of human suffering, where the economy flowed like the rivers, steady and dark and stained with something that couldn't be washed away. The harbor smelled of salt and tar and the particular sweetness of sugar being loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Money moved through the streets like weather, visible in the cut of men's suits, the height of women's bonnets, the polish on carriage wheels. It was a city that knew exactly what it was, that wore its wealth without shame, that had built cathedrals and theaters and grand homes on a foundation of bodies counted as property. Into this world stepped William Thorne on the morning of April 23rd, 1850. He arrived on a merchant vessel from Baltimore, though no one in Baltimore remembered him boarding. He was listed on the passenger manifest as a textile merchant, age 38, though he carried no samples, no letters of introduction, no evidence of any textile business whatsoever. What he did carry was a letter of credit from a Philadelphia bank worth $50,000, an astronomical sum that immediately opened every door in Savannah's commercial district. But it wasn't the money that people remembered. It was his face. Dozens of accounts survive from people who met William Thorne in those first weeks, and they all describe the same unsettling quality. His face was forgettable and unforgettable at the same time. Plain features, medium height, brown hair going grey at the edges, nothing remarkable. Yet everyone who spoke with him reported the same strange sensation, the feeling that they'd met him before, that they knew him from somewhere, though they could never place where. One merchant's wife described it as looking at a mirror that reflected everyone and no one, a face that seemed to shift depending on who was looking at it. Another called him a man made of shadows, substantial enough to touch, but impossible to truly see. Thorne rented a modest but respectable house on Bull Street, hired a housekeeper and a cook, both free people of color, and set about establishing himself in Savannah's business community. He attended church every Sunday at the Independent Presbyterian Church, always sitting in the back, always leaving before the final hymn. He joined the Savannah Cotton Exchange, though he never bought or sold cotton. He was invited to dinners, to social gatherings, to the carefully choreographed dance of Southern society. and he navigated it all with a quiet competence that made him simultaneously invisible and impossible to ignore. And then, 3 months after his arrival, William Thorne did something that would define everything that followed. He bought his first family. The auction was held at the Charleston Hotel on a Thursday morning in July. The air inside the auction hall was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the particular stench of fear. 200 people packed into a space meant for half that many: buyers, sellers, the curious, the cruel. And standing against the far wall, arranged like furniture awaiting appraisal, were the people being sold. Among them was a family, a man named Samuel, his wife Grace, and their 3 children, the oldest no more than 8 years old. Samuel was 32 years old, a skilled carpenter whose owner had died suddenly, forcing the estate sale. Grace was 28, a seamstress whose fingers bore the permanent calluses of her trade. The children, 2 boys and a girl, stood pressed against their mother's skirts, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. The bidding started at $800 for the family. It climbed slowly. A planter from outside Charleston bid $1,000. Another countered with $1,100. The auctioneer's voice rang through the hall, cheerful and mechanical, describing Samuel's strength, Grace's skills, the children's potential future value. When the bidding reached $1,300, it stalled. The auctioneer prepared to bring down his gavel. Then William Thorne raised his hand. $2,000, he said. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd, but something in it made everyone turn. $2,000 was far above market value, absurdly above. The kind of bid that suggested either stupidity or desperation, neither of which were qualities associated with successful businessmen. The auctioneer, surprised, repeated the bid. The other bidders exchanged glances, then withdrew. No one was fool enough to compete with a man willing to overpay so dramatically. The gavel fell. Sold to the gentleman in the grey coat, William Thorne, for $2,000. Thorne paid in cash, counted out in crisp bills that he produced from a leather satchel. He signed the bill of sale with a hand so steady it might have been signing a receipt for groceries. Then he did something that made the auctioneer's assistant pause mid-signature. "I'll need them transported," Thorne said, "but not to my residence in Savannah. I've recently acquired a small property outside the city, near the Ogeechee River. I'll provide you with directions. They're to be taken there directly, with food and water for the journey, and blankets. It's a 3-hour ride. I don't want them arriving exhausted." The assistant nodded slowly, making notes. This too was unusual. Most buyers either took their purchases immediately or had them held until convenient. But Thorne's specific care about food, water, blankets, these weren't the concerns of a typical owner. They were the concerns of someone transporting something precious. The assistant said nothing. He'd learned long ago not to question the eccentricities of wealthy men. Samuel, Grace, and their children were loaded into a wagon the next morning. They were given bread, cheese, and water, just as Thorne had specified. The driver, a man named Coleman who worked for the auction house, later reported something strange about the journey. The family didn't speak. They barely moved. They sat in the wagon bed, touching each other, their eyes fixed on the road behind them as if expecting something. Coleman had transported hundreds of people in his career, and he recognized the look. It was the look of people saying goodbye to everything they'd ever known, the look of people crossing an invisible line from one existence into another. They arrived at Thorne's property as the sun was setting. It was a modest farm, maybe 40 acres, with a small main house, a barn, and 3 cabins that looked recently built. Thorne was waiting for them. He helped Grace down from the wagon personally, steadying her with a hand under her elbow, a gesture so unexpected that she flinched. He knelt to speak to the children at eye level, his voice too low for Coleman to hear. Then he led the family toward one of the cabins. Coleman watched them go, then collected his fee from Thorne and left. He never saw any of them again. But here's what Coleman didn't see, what no one saw except William Thorne and the 5 people who'd just arrived at his property. Here's what happened in that cabin on that July evening in 1850, as the last light faded from the sky and the cicadas began their nightly chorus. Thorne waited until the wagon was gone, until the sound of wheels on dirt had faded into silence. Then he looked at Samuel, at Grace, at the 3 children who were still pressed against their mother's legs, terrified and confused. And he said 6 words that changed everything. You don't belong to me anymore." Samuel stared at him. Grace's hand tightened on her youngest child's shoulder. No one moved. No one breathed. Thorne reached into his coat and pulled out the bill of sale, the legal document that declared Samuel, Grace and their children to be his property, purchased for $2,000. He held it up so they could see it clearly. Then he walked to the cabin's small fireplace, struck a match, and set the paper on fire. They watched it burn, watched the edges curl and blacken, watched their names, their value, their legal status as property turn to ash. When the last ember died, Thorne looked at Samuel again. "You're free," he said. "All of you, free in every way that matters. The law won't recognize it, not yet, maybe not ever in our lifetimes, but you're free, and I'm going to help you disappear." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Grace made a sound, a sharp inhale that might have been the beginning of a sob or a scream or both. Samuel took a step forward, his carpenter's hands hanging at his sides, shaking. "Why?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, looking at something beyond them, beyond the cabin walls, beyond the darkening fields. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him 20 years. "Because someone should," he said. "Because I can. And because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. I will be one of them. Not anymore." That was the beginning. That was the first family. And over the next 7 years, William Thorne would repeat this scene 62 more times, with slight variations, in different locations, under different circumstances. 63 families bought at market price or above, transported to properties that existed on paper but seemed to vanish from physical reality, freed in ceremonies conducted in secret, then moved along a network so carefully constructed that even today we can barely trace its outline. But the story of William Thorne isn't just about what he did, it's about who he was, and that's where everything becomes strange. Because the more you dig into William Thorne's past, the more you try to trace his origins, the more you discover something impossible. William Thorne didn't exist before 1850. There's no birth record, no childhood home, no family, no previous employment. No ship's manifest showing him arriving from Europe, no tax records, no property deeds, nothing. It's as if on April 23, 1850, a fully formed 38-year-old man materialized out of thin air, armed with $50,000 and a mission that would consume the rest of his life. Who was he really? Where did he come from? And how did an ordinary man, if he was ordinary, if he was even a man in the conventional sense, how did he pull off something that required the resources of an organization, the planning of a military operation, and a level of secrecy that has persisted for over 160 years? The first person to notice the pattern was a woman named Constance Merritt. She was 63 years old in 1852, a widow who ran a boarding house on Broughton Street in Savannah, and she had a memory that people described as both a blessing and a curse. She remembered every face, every name, every conversation. She remembered what guests ordered for breakfast 3 years prior, what colored dress a woman wore to church in 1847, which men paid their bills on time, and which ones made excuses. Her mind was a filing cabinet of details, organized and accessible, and it made her very good at running a boarding house. It also made her the first person to see what William Thorne was really doing. Constance first met Thorne in August of 1850 when he came to her boarding house, looking for a room for a business associate arriving from Charleston. The associate never materialized, but Thorne paid for 2 weeks in advance, in cash, and Constance remembered him because of his eyes. They were grey, she told her sister later, grey like morning fog over the river, and they didn't quite focus on you when he spoke. They focused on something behind you, or maybe inside you, like he was reading text written on your soul. It was unsettling. It was also unforgettable. Over the next 18 months, Constance saw Thorne 6 more times, always briefly, always conducting some small transaction, arranging temporary lodging for people who never arrived. purchasing supplies through her connections to local merchants, sending messages through her to contacts in the city. Each interaction was mundane, forgettable on its own. But Constance's mind assembled them like puzzle pieces, and by the winter of 1851, she'd noticed something. Every time Thorne made an arrangement through her, it coincided with an auction. Not just any auction. Specifically auctions where families were being sold intact, parents with children, husbands with wives. She began paying attention. She started attending auctions herself, standing in the back, watching. And there he was, time after time. William Thorne, unremarkable in his grey or brown coat, always positioned where he could see but not be easily seen, always waiting until the bidding stalled before making his move. She watched him buy a mother and her 4 daughters in November, a couple in their 50s in January, 2 brothers and their elderly father in March. Always families, always paying more than necessary, always arranging private transportation to properties outside the city. In April of 1852, Constance did something dangerous. She followed him. She hired a carriage and driver she trusted, a free black man named Augustus who asked no questions and remembered to forget things when necessary. They stayed far enough behind Thorne's wagon that they wouldn't be noticed, close enough to see where he was going. The journey took them north, away from Savannah, into pine forest that grew thicker and darker as the road narrowed. After 2 hours, Thorne's wagon turned onto a barely visible path. Augustus stopped the carriage. They waited. An hour passed, then another. Then as the sun began to set, they saw something impossible. People were walking back down the path toward the main road. The same people who'd been in Thorne's wagon, the family he'd just purchased. A man, his wife, and their 2 teenage sons. But they were walking freely, not in chains, not under guard. Walking like people taking an evening stroll, and they were carrying bundles. Not the small, pathetic bundles of people being moved between owners, but substantial packs, the kind you'd carry if you were traveling a long distance, the kind you'd carry if you were leaving forever. They walked right past Constance's carriage. The man glanced at her, and for just a moment their eyes met. He was crying, not sobbing, not making any sound, but tears were streaming down his face, catching the dying light. He nodded at her once, a tiny movement of acknowledgement or gratitude or warning, she couldn't tell which. Then they were gone, disappeared into the forest as completely as if they'd never existed. Constance never told anyone what she saw that day, but she became Thorne's silent ally, though they never discussed it, never acknowledged what they both knew. When he needed something, a contact, a message delivered, a room held in reserve, she provided it without question. She became part of the network, one of dozens of people who helped Thorne without ever fully understanding the scope of what he was building. Because what William Thorne was building wasn't just a series of isolated rescues, it was a machine. A mechanism as complex and precise as a watchmaker's masterpiece, with gears and springs and tiny moving parts that all had to work in perfect synchronization or the entire thing would shatter. The properties were the first part of the machine. Between 1850 and 1853, Thorne purchased 7 different farms and rural holdings scattered across Georgia and South Carolina. Each one was remote, accessible only by poor roads, surrounded by thick forest or swampland. Each one had a main house and several outbuildings, usually cabins that appeared recently constructed. On paper, they were modest agricultural operations, nothing remarkable. In reality, they were way stations, temporary stops in a journey that led somewhere else entirely. The second part of the machine was the documents. Thorne had access to forgers, extraordinary forgers, people who could create death certificates that looked decades old, who could fabricate entire family histories, who could manufacture the paper trail necessary to transform a person with one identity into a person with another. Where he found these forgers, how he paid them, how he convinced them to risk their lives for his mission, these questions have never been answered, but the documents they produced were flawless, good enough to fool bank officials, census takers, and legal authorities. The third part was transportation. Thorne had established relationships with dozens of wagon drivers, ship captains, and railroad workers, people who could move human cargo without asking questions or keeping records. Some of them were motivated by money, others by conscience. A few were free black people who saw Thorne's work as sacred, a moral imperative that transcended law. They formed the loose network, connected by trust and shared risk, and they moved people north with an efficiency that suggested military planning. The fourth part, the most crucial part, was the destinations. Because the families Thorne didn't just vanish into thin air, they went somewhere. And that somewhere, that final destination, is where the story becomes truly inexplicable. Because according to every investigation, every historical analysis, every attempt to trace these people's movements, they went to places that shouldn't have been able to hide them. Small towns in Pennsylvania, farming communities in upstate New York, settlements in Ohio and Michigan. Places where strangers would be noticed, where questions would be asked, where 200 people suddenly appearing over 7 years should have created a ripple effect in local records. Birth certificates, property deeds, census documents, church records, something should have marked their arrival. But there's nothing, just silence. As if they'd been absorbed into communities that either didn't keep records or kept records that have since been destroyed. The one exception is that photograph. The one from 1862 showing 37 people in Pennsylvania. The graduate student who found it spent months trying to understand how it was possible. How could 37 people, all officially dead according to Georgia and South Carolina records, all connected to William Thorne's documented purchases, be standing alive and well in front of a barn in Pennsylvania? The only explanation she could construct was that entire communities were complicit. That somewhere in the north there were towns where everyone knew, where everyone agreed to keep the secret, where church leaders and government officials and ordinary citizens all participated in a collective act of erasure, hiding people in plain sight by simply refusing to acknowledge their existence in official records while allowing them to live full lives in actual reality. It was an explanation that suggested something bigger than one man's mission. It suggested an organized resistance movement, a network that extended across state lines, that had resources and planning that rivaled anything the Underground Railroad accomplished. And at the center of it all was William Thorne, the man with no past, orchestrating everything with a precision that still defies explanation. But maintaining that level of secrecy, that level of coordination, for 7 years required more than just logistics. It required an almost supernatural ability to anticipate threats and neutralize them before they became dangerous. And Thorne had that ability. Time after time, when someone got too close to discovering what he was doing, something would happen to redirect their attention. Not violence. Thorne never used violence, but coincidences. Fortunate accidents, sudden opportunities that drew suspicious people away from their investigations. In 1853, a Charleston merchant named Douglas Pemberton began asking questions about Thorne's properties. He'd noticed the same pattern Constance had noticed, the correlation between Thorne's purchases and the subsequent disappearance of families from all records. Pemberton was a methodical man, a man who kept detailed ledgers and noticed discrepancies. He started making inquiries. He wrote letters to business associates near Thorne's properties, asking about the operations there, about the people who lived there, about what exactly Thorne was producing that would justify such investments. Before he could receive any answers, Pemberton's warehouse caught fire. It was an accident, clearly an accident, a lamp knocked over by a clumsy worker, but the fire destroyed everything. Pemberton's inventory, his records, his correspondence, all of it turned to ash. The fire nearly bankrupted him. He spent the next 2 years rebuilding his business, and in that time, his curiosity about William Thorne simply evaporated, displaced by the immediate demands of survival. Was it really an accident? Or was it Thorne's network in action removing a threat before it could fully form? There's no way to know, but the timing was remarkable, and it wasn't the only time something like that happened. Over 7 years, at least 4 different people who showed too much interest in Thorne's activities experienced sudden reversals of fortune that consumed their attention and ended their investigations. Businesses failed, family emergencies erupted, health crises emerged, always at exactly the right moment to pull them away from dangerous questions. It created an aura around Thorne, a sense that he was protected by forces beyond normal comprehension. Some people whispered that he had powerful allies in northern cities, abolitionists with money and influence who could reach across state lines to protect him. Others suggested something darker, that Thorne had made bargains with entities that existed outside human law, that his success was purchased at a cost we couldn't see. These whispers never became loud enough to attract official attention, but they circulated in the shadows, adding to the growing mythology around the quiet man with the grey eyes who bought families and made them disappear. But Thorne wasn't invincible. He was human, whatever else he might have been, and humans make mistakes. In the fall of 1854, he made his first one. He bought a family at an auction in Savannah, a young couple named David and Sarah with their infant daughter. The purchase itself was unremarkable, following Thorne's usual pattern. But this time someone was watching who understood exactly what they were seeing. His name was Jeremiah Cole. He was 26 years old, educated at Harvard, the son of a prominent Boston abolitionist family. And he'd come south specifically to document the workings of the slave economy for a book he was writing. Cole was brilliant, observant, and fearless in a way that came from privilege and youth, a combination that made him dangerous. He'd been in Savannah for 3 months, attending auctions, interviewing traders, gathering the kind of detailed first-hand information that Northern abolitionists desperately wanted but rarely obtain. And he noticed William Thorne immediately. Cole recognized something in Thorne that others missed. He saw past the forgettable face and the unremarkable clothes and recognized a fellow actor, someone playing a role. He began following Thorne with the same methodical attention Constance had used, but with more resources and more time. He tracked Thorne's purchases. He mapped his properties. He interviewed people who'd done business with him, and slowly, piece by piece, Cole assembled a picture that horrified and fascinated him in equal measure. Thorne was freeing people. Somehow, impossibly, in the heart of the South, surrounded by laws designed to prevent exactly this, he was buying enslaved people and setting them free. Not just freeing them, but erasing them from existence, giving them new identities, moving them north, building entire new lives for them. It was the most audacious thing Cole had ever encountered. It was also illegal in ways that carried the death penalty. Cole faced a dilemma. As an abolitionist, he should have been thrilled. This was everything his father's movement worked toward, the practical liberation of enslaved people. But as a writer, as someone who'd come south to document reality, he understood that exposing Thorne would end his operation immediately. It would also likely result in Thorne's execution and the recapture of everyone he'd freed. The moral calculus was impossible. Save the mission by staying silent, or tell the truth and destroy everything. In December of 1854, Cole made his decision. He approached Thorne directly. It happened outside a church service, on a cold morning when frost covered the ground and their breath turned to fog in the air. Cole stepped into Thorne's path as he was leaving, close enough that Thorne couldn't avoid him without causing a scene. "Mr. Thorne," Cole said quietly, "my name is Jeremiah Cole. I'm a writer for Boston, and I know what you're doing. I know about the families. I know about the properties. I know about the network. And I think we need to talk." Thorne's face didn't change. He looked at Cole with those grey, unfocused eyes, and for a moment Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. Then Thorne nodded once. "Tomorrow," he said. "My house, 2 o'clock. Come alone. And Mr. Cole, understand this. If you're lying, if you're working with authorities, people will die. People who trust me. People who have no other hope. So before you come tomorrow, before you knock on my door, ask yourself if whatever you want is worth that cost." Cole did go. He went alone, as instructed, and what happened in Thorne's house that afternoon has never been fully documented. But Cole emerged 3 hours later, pale and shaking, and he never wrote his book. He never published anything about Thorne or the families or what he'd discovered. He returned to Boston 2 weeks later and abandoned writing entirely, taking a position teaching literature at a small college where he spent the next 40 years living a quiet, unremarkable life. The only record of what he learned is a single letter he wrote to his father, now preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society. Most of the letter is mundane, updates about health and weather and family. But at the end, in handwriting that becomes increasingly erratic, Cole wrote this: "Father, I have seen something I cannot explain. A man who should not exist, doing things that should not be possible, for reasons that transcend anything we've discussed in our parlor debates about morality and justice. He is not what we imagined. He is not a hero. He is not a saint. He is something else entirely, something that makes me question the very nature of what we call reality. I cannot write about him. To do so would be to betray not just his mission, but something fundamental about the universe's workings. You taught me that truth is sacred, but I have learned that some truths are too dangerous for daylight. Some truths must remain hidden, not because they're false, but because they are too true, too real, too far beyond our ability to comprehend or contain. I am abandoning my book. I am coming home. And I beg you, do not ask me why. What did Thorne tell him? What did Cole see in that 3-hour conversation that shattered his certainty and silenced him forever? We'll never know. But Cole's retreat marked a turning point. After 1854, the whispers about Thorne changed. Before, they'd been whispers of curiosity, of mild suspicion. After, they carried a note of fear. Not fear of what Thorne might do, but fear of what he represented, of the impossible thing he was accomplishing in a world that insisted such things were impossible. And then, in the spring of 1855, Thorne did something that proved just how confident he'd become. He started attending abolitionist meetings, not in the South, obviously, but during his increasingly frequent trips north to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, he began showing up at gatherings of the movement's most prominent figures. He never spoke. He never identified himself beyond the name William Thorne. He simply sat in the back and listened, his grey eyes watching everything, his presence creating a ripple of discomfort that no one could quite explain. Frederick Douglass met him at one such gathering in New York in October of 1855. Douglass, already famous, already recognized as one of the movement's most powerful voices, later described the encounter in his private journal. "There was a man at the meeting tonight," Douglass wrote, "who troubled me in ways I cannot articulate. He said nothing, asked no questions, but I felt his attention like a physical weight, as if he were measuring not just my words but my soul. After the meeting, I approached him, extended my hand, gave my name. He shook my hand, his grip firm but strange, neither warm nor cold, just present. He gave his name as William Thorne. I asked what brought him to our cause. He smiled, a sad smile that seemed to carry centuries of grief, and said only this: 'I am trying to correct an error.' I asked what error. He said, 'The error of believing that some humans are less human than others. The error of thinking that paper and law and tradition can make evil righteous. The error that good people can witness atrocity and do nothing because action is difficult.' Then he left. I have no idea who he is, but I believe with a certainty I cannot explain that he is doing something important, something that transcends anything the rest of us have accomplished." By 1856, William Thorne had been operating in the South for 6 years, and the impossible had become routine. 51 families freed, 173 people erased from the records of human property and reborn into lives whose details remain shadowed even now. The machine he'd built was running with terrifying efficiency, each component synchronized, each risk calculated and managed. But something was changing. Not in Thorne's operation, but in Thorne himself. People who'd known him since 1850 began reporting subtle shifts in his behavior. Constance Merritt noticed it first. When Thorne came to her boarding house in February of 1856 to arrange lodging for contacts passing through Savannah, his hands were shaking. Not dramatically, just a faint tremor when he counted out payment, when he signed the register. His grey eyes, usually so focused on that invisible point beyond whoever he was speaking to, now seemed to have trouble focusing at all. He looked tired in a way that transcended lack of sleep. He looked like a man carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him from the inside out. "Mr. Thorne," Constance asked carefully, "are you well? You seem troubled." Thorne smiled, that same sad smile Frederick Douglass had described, and shook his head slightly. "Troubled is perhaps too small a word, Mrs. Merritt, but thank you for your concern. I am simply discovering that there are costs to this work that cannot be measured in money or risk. Costs that accumulate in places I did not know existed." He left before she could ask what he meant. But over the following months, others noticed the same deterioration. Augustus, the carriage driver who'd helped Constance follow Thorne years earlier and who'd since become a regular part of the network, reported seeing Thorne standing alone at the docks late at night. staring out at the dark water as if searching for something in the waves. A clerk at one of the banks Thorne used mentioned that he'd come in to conduct business and had forgotten, mid-transaction, what he was there for, standing at the counter in silence for nearly a minute before remembering. Most disturbing was an incident reported by a shopkeeper named Henry Wu, a Chinese immigrant who sold imported goods and who'd occasionally provided supplies for Thorne's properties. Wu was working late one evening in March when Thorne entered the shop. It was past closing time, but Wu knew Thorne and let him in. Thorne wandered through the aisles, touching items without seeming to see them, his movements those of a sleepwalker. Finally, he stopped in front of a mirror. Wu kept near the back of the shop, and he stared at his own reflection for what Wu estimated was 5 full minutes. Then he spoke, apparently to his reflection, in a voice so quiet Wu had to strain to hear it. "I don't recognize you anymore," Thorne said. "I don't know if I ever did. Were you always this? Or did this make you what you are? Does it matter?" He pressed his palm against the mirror, matching it to his reflection's palm. "How many more? How many until it's enough? Will it ever be enough?" Then he turned and left without buying anything, without acknowledging Wu's presence, as if he'd forgotten the shopkeeper was there. Wu, deeply unsettled, told Constance about the incident. She in turn mentioned it to others in the network, and a quiet concern began to spread. Thorne was unraveling. Whatever was driving him, whatever guilt or grief or moral imperative had set him on this path, it was consuming him. The question became not whether he would complete his mission, but whether he would survive it. But despite his personal deterioration, or perhaps because of it, Thorne's work accelerated. In 1856 alone, he freed 12 families, more than any previous year. The purchases came faster, the transportation more efficient, the entire operation moving with an urgency that suggested a deadline. It was as if Thorne knew his time was running out and was racing to save as many people as possible before whatever was breaking inside him finally shattered completely. Then, in September of 1856, Thorne made a purchase that would become legendary among the few people who knew about his work. At an estate auction in Charleston, a family was being sold that had been together for 3 generations on the same plantation. The patriarch was a man named Elijah, 72 years old, a blacksmith whose hands were gnarled with arthritis, but whose mind remained sharp. With him were his son Thomas, Thomas's wife Rebecca, and their 5 children ranging from age 4 to 16. Also included were Elijah's brother Isaac and Isaac's wife Martha, both in their late 60s. 9 people, 3 generations, the kind of intact family unit that was increasingly rare in a system designed to maximize profit through separation. The bidding was intense. Several plantation owners wanted the younger, stronger members of the family, willing to buy the whole group just to get the workers they needed. The price climbed rapidly. $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. When it reached $5,000, a staggering sum, the room fell silent. The auctioneer began his countdown, and then William Thorne, standing in his usual position near the back, raised his hand. $10,000, he said, his voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Clean, sharp, final. The room erupted in murmurs. $10,000 was an insane price. It was more than many plantations were worth. It was a sum that suggested either unlimited wealth or complete madness. The auctioneer, stunned, called for additional bids, but no one was willing to compete with such irrational generosity. The gavel fell. Sold to William Thorne for $10,000, the highest single purchase price ever recorded in Charleston's auction records. Thorne arranged for the family to be transported to his property near the Savannah River, the most remote of his holdings, accessible only by boat or through miles of treacherous swampland. He traveled with them personally, something he rarely did, sitting in the wagon beside Elijah, the elderly blacksmith, speaking with him in low tones throughout the journey. When they arrived at the property, as the sun was setting and the sky was turning the color of old blood, Thorne conducted the ceremony that had become his ritual. He showed them the bill of sale. He burned it in front of them. He spoke the words that he'd now spoken 62 times before. "You're free, all of you. And I'm going to help you disappear." But this time, something different happened. Elijah, the 72-year-old blacksmith who'd spent his entire life in bondage, who'd been born into slavery and watched his children and grandchildren born into the same nightmare, This man had survived 7 decades of systematic dehumanization, looked at William Thorne with tears streaming down his weathered face, and asked the question that everyone in the network had been wondering. Why are you doing this? Who are you? Thorne was silent for a long time. The family waited, 9 people gathered in the fading light, watching the strange, haunted man who'd just spent a fortune to free them. Finally Thorne spoke, and what he said would be remembered and repeated by Elijah's descendants for generations, one of the few direct statements about his motivations that has survived. "I am nobody," Thorne said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am a ghost, trying to atone for sins that may not even be mine. I am a man who discovered too late that the world is built on cruelties. We accept because we benefit from them, and I cannot accept them anymore. I cannot walk through a city built on your suffering and pretend I don't see it. I cannot sleep in comfort purchased with your pain. I cannot call myself human while treating you as less than human. So I do this. It's inadequate. It's insufficient. 63 families out of millions, a drop of water against an ocean of injustice. But it's what I can do. It's what I must do. Because if I don't, then I'm complicit, and I have been complicit in too many things for too many years. I will not be complicit in this." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "You asked who I am. I don't have an answer. I was someone once, before I came here, before I began this work. But that person is gone. Dead. What stands before you now is what remains, a hollow thing, animated only by the need to do something right, in a world drowning in wrong. That's all I am. That's all I can be." Elijah nodded slowly as if this answer, strange and incomplete as it was, somehow made sense to him. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and took Thorne's hand, his blacksmith's grip still strong despite the arthritis. "Then I will pray for you," Elijah said, "because a man who gives everything and calls it nothing needs prayers more than most. You say you're a ghost, but ghosts don't bleed, and I can see you're bleeding from wounds I cannot see. Whatever you were, whatever sins you're atoning for, I hope you find peace. And I hope you know that for 9 people standing here tonight, you are salvation itself." Thorne pulled his hand away gently, shaking his head. "I am not salvation. I am barely a detour. The real work, the real freedom that comes from something much larger than one man buying families. But until that larger thing arrives, until this entire rotten system collapses under the weight of its own evil, I will do what I can. And you, all of you, you will disappear. You will go north. You will be given new names, new histories, new lives, and you will forget William Thorne ever existed, because that's the only way this works. That's the only way you stay safe." 3 days later, Elijah and his family were gone, absorbed into the network, moved along the invisible rails of Thorne's machine toward destinations unknown. But Elijah kept his word. He prayed for William Thorne every day for the rest of his life. And before he died in 1889, at the remarkable age of 105, living free in a small town in Ohio under a different name, he told his story to his grandchildren. He told them about the ghost who bought them, about the man who burned their papers and set them free, about the hollow thing animated only by the need to do something right. That story was passed down through the family, written down eventually, preserved in private archives where it remains today. One of the few first-hand accounts of what William Thorne actually said about himself. But if Thorne thought his encounter with Elijah would remain private, he was wrong, because someone else was watching that night. Someone who'd been watching for months, tracking Thorne's movements with an obsessive attention to detail that rivaled Thorne's own careful planning. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was a slave catcher, one of the best in the business. A man who'd built a lucrative career tracking runaways and returning them to their owners for substantial bounties. Webb was not like the brutal, ignorant men who usually filled his profession. He was educated, intelligent, methodical. He approached his work with the same dispassionate efficiency a good lawyer might bring to contract law. To him, enslaved people were property, their flight was theft, and his job was to recover stolen goods. He felt no particular malice toward the people he caught, nor any moral qualms about returning them to bondage. It was simply business, and he was very good at it. But William Thorne fascinated Webb in ways that transcended business. Webb had first heard about Thorne in 1855, rumors of a man who bought families that subsequently vanished. Initially, Webb dismissed it as gossip, the kind of nonsense that circulated in the city where everyone speculated about everyone else's business. But the rumors persisted, and Webb began investigating. What he discovered disturbed him profoundly, not because of moral outrage, but because it suggested an operation that rivaled his own in sophistication and exceeded it in scope. Webb spent 8 months tracking Thorne, using techniques he perfected over years of hunting runaways. He mapped Thorne's properties. He identified members of the network, people like Constance and Augustus, who aided Thorne without fully understanding the scale of his operations. He documented purchases, cross-referenced them with census records and plantation ledgers, and slowly assembled a picture of what Thorne had accomplished. 63 families, over 200 people, all vanished with a completeness that suggested either mass murder, which seemed unlikely given Thorne's character and methods, or something far more complex and far more illegal. Webb's investigation led him to the property near the Savannah River on the night Thorne freed Elijah's family. He watched from a distance, hidden in the swampland vegetation, using a telescope to observe the ceremony. He saw the bill of sale burned. He heard, faintly, the cadence of Thorne's voice, though not the specific words. He saw the family's reaction, the tears, the embraces, the transformation from property to people that happened in the span of minutes, and he understood immediately what he was witnessing. Webb faced a choice similar to the one Jeremiah Cole had faced years earlier. He could expose Thorne, collect substantial rewards from multiple owners whose human property had disappeared, and destroy the entire operation. It would be the most successful single action of his career, a legend-making capture. Or he could stay silent, allow the operation to continue, and accept that some things were beyond his ability to stop or his right to interfere with. For 3 days, Webb wrestled with this decision. He was not a moral man in the conventional sense, but he was a thoughtful one. He understood that what Thorne was doing, while illegal, was being done with a care and attention that suggested something more than simple abolitionist zeal. Thorne wasn't smuggling people north in the chaotic, desperate manner of the Underground Railroad, where secrecy was maintained through ignorance and compartmentalization. Thorne's operation was different. It was surgical, precise. Each family carefully selected, each extraction planned with obsessive detail, each new life constructed with the same attention an architect might bring to designing a cathedral. On the 4th day, Webb made his decision. He wrote to Savannah and requested a meeting with Thorne. The meeting took place in the same house where Jeremiah Cole had met with Thorne years before. Webb was direct, laying out everything he'd discovered, every detail of Thorne's operation, every member of the network he'd identified. Thorne listened without interrupting, his grey eyes focused on Webb with an intensity that made the slave catcher deeply uncomfortable. When Webb finished, silence filled the room. Then Thorne spoke, his voice calm, almost gentle. "So you know everything. What do you want?" Webb leaned back in his chair, studying the strange man across from him. "I want to understand why. I've tracked hundreds of runaways, Mr. Thorne. I've seen every variation of desperate escape, every clever plan, every passionate rescue attempt. But I've never seen anything like what you're doing. This isn't passion. This isn't desperation. This is something else. Something I cannot categorize. So before I decide what to do with what I know, I want to understand what drives you. Because understanding you, I think, is key to understanding whether what you're doing is heroism or madness." Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, as if he were channeling something larger than his individual experience. "Have you ever watched someone die, Mr. Webb? Not in violence, not quickly, but slowly, over years, watching their humanity erode piece by piece until what remains is just a shell performing the motions of life? Have you ever loved someone and been forced to watch them become less than themselves, diminished by forces you could not stop, until one day you realized they were gone even though their bodies still moved and breathed?" Webb said nothing. Thorne continued. "I have. I watched it happen. I was complicit in it. And when I finally understood what I'd been party to, When I finally saw the full horror of what I'd allowed and benefited from, it broke something in me. Something fundamental. I could not continue being who I was. I could not live in that skin anymore. So I became this. I became William Thorne. I became a ghost trying to haunt the living into seeing what I was blind to for too long. This work, these families, it's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I can do. And I will continue doing it until I am caught and executed, or until the entire system collapses, whichever comes first. Webb absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. Then he asked the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Who were you before you became William Thorne? Thorne smiled, that sad, ancient smile. Someone who doesn't deserve to be remembered, someone who did terrible things through inaction and cowardice. That person is dead, Mr. Webb. He died in 1849, and what rose from his ashes is this hollow thing you see before you. Don't try to find him. He's gone. And good riddance. Marcus Webb left that meeting profoundly shaken. He never reported what he'd learned about Thorne. He never collected the bounties that were rightfully his. He never spoke about the encounter to anyone. He simply returned to his work, tracking individual runaways as he always had, but with a new awareness of the vast, invisible structures that existed beneath the visible world. He continued his profession for another 6 years until the war started and rendered his entire career obsolete. He died in 1868, and in his personal effects, his family found a journal entry from November of 1856, written shortly after his meeting with Thorne. Today I met a man who should not exist, doing things that should not be possible, for reasons I cannot fully comprehend. He is either the most moral man I have ever encountered, or the most deluded. Perhaps there is no difference. I have decided not to interfere with his work. Not because I agree with it, not because I've suddenly discovered a conscience, but because I recognize something in him that terrifies me. He is a man who has looked into the abyss of his own complicity, and rather than look away, he has thrown himself into it, determined to fill it one person at a time with acts of redemption that can never be adequate to the crime. He is drowning in his own moral horror, and yet he continues. There is something both pitiful and magnificent in that. I cannot stop him. I will not try. Let the ghosts do their work. The living have made enough of a mess already. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. On the evening of March 14, 1857, William Thorne freed his 63rd and final family. They were a couple named James and Ruth with their 3 young sons, purchased that morning at an auction in Savannah for $1,800. The ceremony followed the pattern established over 7 years. The bill of sale burned, the words spoken, the transformation from property to people, accomplished in the time it takes fire to consume paper. But this time, after the family departed for the network that would carry them north, Thorne did something he'd never done before. He stayed at the property alone. The property was his first one, the farm near the Ojiji River, where he'd freed Samuel and Grace and their children back in 1850. It had been the beginning of everything, and now, it seemed, it would be the end. Constance Merritt was the last person to see him. She'd accompanied the family to ensure their smooth transfer to the next stage of the network, and she stayed behind when the others left, concerned about Thorne's deteriorating condition. They sat together on the porch of the small main house as darkness fell and the night sounds of rural Georgia rose around them. "It's finished," Thorne said quietly, staring out at the fields that were barely visible in the dying light. 7 years, 63 families, 214 people. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's all I can do. I'm done. Constance studied his profile, this strange man who dominated her thoughts and shaped her actions for nearly 7 years. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Where will you go?" Thorne was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice distant, as if he were already halfway to somewhere else. "I'm going to disappear, the same way they did, completely. William Thorne will cease to exist, just as Thomas Garrett and John Matthews and Robert Sterling and all the other names I've used over the years cease to exist. I'll become someone else, or maybe I'll become no one at all. It doesn't matter. This work is finished, and the man who did it needs to vanish with it." "They'll look for you," Constance warned. "Once people realize what you've done, Once the full scope of it becomes clear, there will be investigations, manhunts, wanted posters. You freed over 200 people, William. That's not something that can be hidden forever." Thorne smiled, but there was no humor in it, only a profound weariness that made him look decades older than whatever his true age was. "Let them look. They won't find anything. I've been very careful, Mrs. Merritt. Every document, every record, every piece of evidence that connects William Thorne to these disappearances has been destroyed or altered. The properties will be sold through intermediaries, the money distributed to those who helped, the network dismantled so thoroughly that no one can prove it ever existed. And William Thorne himself will simply fade away like morning fog over the river. By the time anyone realizes what happened, it will be too late to stop it or to punish anyone for it." He turned to look at her then, and Constance saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It wasn't just weariness, it was finality, the look of a man who'd finished something that had consumed him entirely and now had nothing left to live for. "Promise me something," Thorne said. "Promise me you'll forget me, all of you, everyone in the network. Forget William Thorne ever existed. Remember the families, remember their names, their faces, their freedom. But let me disappear completely. That's the only way this works. That's the only way they stay safe. Can you do that?" Constance wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him that what he'd done deserved to be remembered, celebrated, recorded in history as one of the most extraordinary acts of moral courage she'd ever witnessed. But she saw the desperate need in his eyes, the absolute conviction that his erasure was necessary for their survival, so she nodded. "I promise," she whispered. "We'll forget you." Thorne stood then, his movements slow, as if his body were fighting against some immense weight. "Thank you for everything, for your help, your discretion, your courage. You saved more lives than you know." He held out his hand. Constance took it, feeling the tremor that had become constant, the physical manifestation of whatever was breaking inside him. Then he released her hand and walked into the house. She waited, listening to the sounds of him moving through rooms, gathering whatever few possessions he intended to take. When he emerged half an hour later, he carried only a small leather satchel, the same one he'd arrived with 7 years ago. They walked together to where her carriage waited. Thorne helped her up, a final gesture of the courtesy that had always characterized his interactions. Then he stepped back, and Constance saw him clearly in the lamplight. This man who'd been a ghost all along, who'd never been fully present in the world he moved through. "Goodbye, Mrs. Merritt," he said. "Thank you for seeing what I was trying to do. Thank you for helping when you could have exposed me. Thank you for being better than I deserved." "Goodbye, Mr. Thorne," Constance replied, her voice breaking slightly. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for. I hope you find peace." Thorne shook his head slowly. "Peace isn't for people like me. Peace is for those who've earned it. I'm just trying to balance the scales, and the scales don't balance. They never balance. But maybe somewhere, in some way I cannot see, what I've done matters. That's all I can hope for." The carriage pulled away. Constance looked back once and saw Thorne standing in the road, a solitary figure silhouetted against the lamplight from the house, already fading into the darkness. Then the carriage turned a corner, and he was gone. That was the last confirmed sighting of William Thorne. He never returned to his house on Bull Street in Savannah. He never contacted anyone in the network again. He never collected money owed to him from various business ventures. He simply vanished, and with him, the last remaining evidence of his operation disappeared as well. The properties were sold within 6 months through a maze of intermediaries so complex that tracing them became impossible. The money went to various beneficiaries, people who'd helped over the years, but none of them knew who'd arranged the transfers. The documents that might have proven what happened were gone, destroyed or hidden so thoroughly that they've never been found. For a year, authorities investigated. Sheriff's departments across Georgia and South Carolina searched for William Thorne, motivated initially by suspicious creditors and later by rumors of his activities that were too substantial to ignore completely. But they found nothing. No body, no trail, no evidence of where he'd gone or what he'd become. It was as if he'd never existed at all, except for the persistent absence of families in the records, gaps in the ledgers that couldn't be explained through conventional means. Here, on Macabre Mysteries of America, we spent years investigating cases where reality proves stranger than any fiction we could create. But the case of William Thorne stands alone in its stubborn refusal to yield answers even after more than a century and a half of investigation. Some historians believe Thorne died shortly after his disappearance, either by his own hand or through natural causes, his body buried in some unmarked grave where it will never be found. The deterioration Constance and others witnessed in his final year suggests a man whose physical and mental health were failing, someone who might not have survived long after completing his mission. This theory is supported by the complete absence of any evidence of his continued existence after March of 1857. No further purchases, no sightings, no letters, nothing. Other researchers suggest something more complex. They point to occasional reports over the following decades of a man matching Thorne's description appearing briefly in various northern cities, always in connection with abolitionist activities, always using different names, always disappearing before anyone could verify his identity. These sightings continued into the 1860s during the Civil War, and even into the 1870s, though they became increasingly rare and difficult to confirm. If these reports are accurate, it would suggest that Thorne didn't die but simply moved on to other work, other missions, other attempts to correct what he called the error of believing that some humans are less human than others. There's also the photograph. That impossible photograph from 1862 showing 37 people who should have been dead standing alive in Pennsylvania. The graduate student who discovered it identified several of the people as individuals purchased by William Thorne in the early 1850s. But she also found something else in the photograph, something she mentioned only once before abandoning her research. In the background, barely visible, standing in the doorway of the barn behind the group, there's a figure. The photograph quality is poor, the figure is in shadow, and it's impossible to make out any identifying features. But the graduate student's notes include this observation: figure in background matches approximate height and build of William Thorne, posture suggests male, age uncertain. Right hand appears to be resting on doorframe in manner consistent with tremor or weakness, possibly supporting body weight. Cannot confirm identity. But position in photograph suggests observer rather than participant, someone documenting, not joining, someone who needed to see the result of his work but could not be part of it. A ghost watching the living. Is that figure William Thorne? Did he survive long enough to see some of the families he freed, to witness the lives they built, to know that his impossible mission had succeeded at least partially? We'll never know for certain, but the possibility haunts everyone who studies this case. What we do know with certainty is what happened to the families. This is where the story, despite all its mysteries, offers something like closure. Through painstaking genealogical research, through the few family stories that were preserved and eventually shared, through census records and church documents and gravestones, historians have been able to trace the fates of approximately 40% of the people William Thorne freed. And what they found is remarkable. The families survived. They built lives in the North, in small towns and farming communities where they were absorbed into populations that either didn't know their origins or chose to keep those origins secret. They worked, they raised children, they participated in communities, they lived full, complete human lives, the kind of lives that had been stolen from them by the system Thorne had pulled them out of. Some of their descendants fought in the Civil War on the Union side, a bitter irony that would not have been lost on Thorne. Many became part of the Great Northern Migration of Black Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, moving to cities, building businesses, contributing to the cultural and economic fabric of the nation. Elijah, the 72-year-old blacksmith Thorne had purchased for $10,000, lived to be 105, dying peacefully in Ohio, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all of them born free. His grandson became a teacher. His great-granddaughter became a doctor. The family he represented, those 9 people across 3 generations, produced over 120 descendants over the following century, all of them living lives that would have been impossible under the system that had once owned them. Samuel and Grace, the first family Thorne freed, the carpenter and seamstress and their 3 children who stood in that cabin in 1850 and watched their bill of sale burn. They disappeared more completely than most. But in 1998, a woman named Elizabeth Hayes contacted the South Carolina Historical Society with a story. Her great-great-grandmother, she said, had been a woman named Grace who arrived in Pennsylvania in 1850 with her husband and children, claiming to be refugees from a plantation fire that had killed their owner. Grace had lived to be 73, dying in 1891, and before her death, she'd told her daughters the truth, that there had been no fire, that a man named William Thorne had bought them and set them free, burning their papers, giving them new names, sending them north with money and instructions and hope. Grace had made her daughters promise never to speak about it while anyone who might remember was still alive. But now, Elizabeth said, more than a century later, it was time to tell the truth. Time to honor the ghost who'd saved them. Elizabeth brought documents to support her story. A Bible that had belonged to Grace, with a handwritten inscription on the inside cover, "To Samuel and Grace and their children, may you build a life worthy of your freedom. May you never forget what was stolen from you, and may you never take for granted what has been returned. From a friend who will fade from memory, but who will never forget you." The handwriting matched samples of William Thorne's signature from business documents in Savannah. These stories, slowly emerging over the decades as descendants felt safe enough to share them. As the system that had threatened them crumbled into history, these stories paint a picture of Thorne's legacy. 214 people freed, hundreds of descendants living lives that would not have existed without his intervention. It's a tangible impact, measurable in births and marriages and accomplishments that trace back to those 63 families. But the larger question remains unanswered. Who was William Thorne? Not what he did, but who he was, before he became the ghost who haunted the antebellum South. The only clue, if it can be called that, comes from one final document. In 1923, the same year Dorothy Hayes discovered the ledger that first revealed the pattern of disappearing families, another discovery was made. A safety deposit box in a Philadelphia bank, rented in 1849 under the name Marcus Sterling, had gone unclaimed for 74 years. According to banking regulations, it was opened by the institution. Inside was a single item, a journal bound in black leather containing approximately 50 pages of handwritten text. The bank contacted historians who examined the journal carefully. The handwriting matched William Thorne's, but the content was disturbing in ways that made several researchers refuse to continue studying it. The journal contained no dates, no names, no specific places. It read like the confession of a man drowning in guilt for crimes that were never explicitly described. Page after page of self-recrimination, of moral horror, of a consciousness wrestling with complicity in evil. One passage, widely quoted among the few historians who studied the journal, reads, "I was part of it. I benefited from it. I looked away when I should have looked directly at the horror I was enabling. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I was just one person, that the system was bigger than me, that my hands were tied. All lies. Comfortable lies that allowed me to sleep at night while others suffered from my comfort. But now I see clearly. Now I understand the full weight of my complicity. And I cannot continue being who I was. That person must die. And from his death perhaps something useful can be born. Not redemption. I don't deserve redemption. But action. Concrete action that might, in some small way, begin to repay the debt I owe to those I harmed through my cowardice and inaction." Another passage. "They asked me why I'm doing this. These people I'm trying to help. They want to understand my motivations, to place me in some category that makes sense to them. Hero, madman, zealot. But I am none of these things. I am simply a man who woke up one morning and could no longer live with himself, who saw his reflection and recognized a monster wearing a civilized face, and who decided that the only way to stop being that monster was to burn his old life entirely and build something new from the ashes. This is not heroism. This is survival, the survival of whatever fragment of humanity still exists inside me. The journal never reveals who William Thorne was before he became William Thorne. It never names the specific crimes he felt guilty for, the specific people he felt he'd harmed. It's the confession of a ghost, lacking the concrete details that would make it historically useful. But it provides a psychological portrait of a man driven by guilt so profound it consumed his entire existence, transforming him into an instrument of redemption that operated outside normal human categories. Some researchers have speculated that Thorne was a former slave trader, someone who'd made his fortune in human misery and then experienced a moral crisis that destroyed his ability to continue. Others suggest he might have been a plantation owner who witnessed something that shattered his moral certainty. Still others propose that he was a northern businessman whose wealth came from industries that depended on slave labor, cotton mills perhaps, or textile manufacturing, and who finally confronted the human cost of his prosperity. But these are all speculations. The truth of who William Thorne was before 1850 remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American history. What we're left with is the legacy. 214 people freed, families kept intact, lives saved, and a ghost story, the story of a man who appeared from nowhere, did something impossible, and then vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and the faint traces of his extraordinary work. In an era defined by unimaginable cruelty, by a system that treated humans as property and justified it with law and custom and twisted theology, one man decided to act. Not with grand speeches or public declarations, but with quiet, methodical, relentless action over 7 years. He spent his fortune, he risked his life, he recruited others to risk theirs. And then, when his work was done, he erased himself as completely as he'd erased the families from the records of bondage. Was he a hero? That's a complicated question. His methods were illegal. His actions, if discovered, would have endangered not just himself, but everyone in his network. His mission, while morally defensible from our contemporary perspective, violated every law of the society he operated in. And his motivations, rooted in what appears to have been crushing guilt, suggest someone driven less by pure altruism and more by a desperate need for personal redemption. Heroes, we like to think, are motivated by selfless love of humanity. Thorne seems to have been motivated by self-hatred, by a need to atone for sins we cannot identify. But perhaps that distinction doesn't matter. Perhaps the motivation is less important than the action. Whatever drove William Thorne, whatever guilt consumed him, whatever crimes he felt he needed to atone for, the result was that 214 people gained their freedom. 214 people were given the chance to build lives that the system had declared impossible. And from those 214 people came generations of descendants who would never have existed otherwise. The photograph from 1862, if the graduate student's observations were correct, if that shadowed figure in the background really was William Thorne, suggests he lived long enough to see at least some result of his work, to see people he'd freed alive and well, building community, creating futures. If that's true, then perhaps he found something like peace in his final years. Or perhaps he simply found confirmation that his impossible mission had succeeded, that the ghost had managed to haunt the living into freedom. We'll never know for certain. The mystery of William Thorne, like the man himself, remains elusive, just beyond our ability to fully comprehend or explain. But the families he freed, the lives they built, the descendants they produced, these are real, these are measurable, these are the concrete legacy of a ghost's mission. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of this entire strange, disturbing, beautiful story. That one person, driven by whatever motivations, operating in secret, working against a system that seemed unbreakable, can make a difference. Not a revolutionary difference. Not a difference that topples empires or rewrites history, but a real, tangible difference in specific lives. 63 families, 214 people. Hundreds of descendants who exist because a ghost decided to act. The ledger that Dorothy Hayes discovered in 1923 still exists, preserved now in climate-controlled archives, those 47 names written in immaculate cursive, representing only a portion of Thorne's work. Historians have since identified 16 additional families that match the pattern, bringing the total to 63. Each name represents a life saved, a family kept whole, a future made possible. And in the margins of some pages, in handwriting that matches William Thorne's, there are occasional notations. Brief phrases: arrived safely, new life begun, freedom earned. As if he'd kept track, as if he'd needed to know that his work had mattered, that the people he'd freed had actually made it to freedom and not been recaptured, not been betrayed, not been dragged back into the nightmare he'd pulled them from. The last entry in the ledger is dated March 14, 1857. James and Ruth and their 3 sons. and below their names, in that same careful handwriting, one final note: "It is finished. May they forgive me for not doing more. May I find whatever comes next for ghosts who've completed their haunting." Then nothing. Silence. The complete and total disappearance of William Thorne from history. Was it death? Was it transformation into yet another identity, another ghost, another mission? Was it simply the exhaustion of a man who'd given everything he had and had nothing left to give? We don't know. We may never know. But on quiet nights, in archives where old ledgers are preserved, in small towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, where descendants of those 63 families still live, in the collective memory of a nation still grappling with the legacy of slavery, the ghost of William Thorne lingers. Not as a historical figure whose life we can trace and document, but as a question. A persistent, unanswerable question about what we owe to each other, about the cost of complicity, about the possibility of redemption, and about what one person can accomplish when driven by forces we cannot fully understand. The man who secretly bought families to set them free, then vanished. The ghost who haunted the living into freedom, William Thorne. Gone, but never quite forgotten. Present in every gap in the records, every unexplained disappearance, every family that shouldn't have survived, but somehow did. A mystery wrapped in an enigma, bound in cracked leather the color of dried blood, filed away in archives where the past refuses to stay silent. And somewhere, in some way we cannot see, perhaps he's still watching, still counting, still haunted by the work he did and the work he couldn't do. Still asking himself the question he asked Elijah that night in 1856, how many more? How many until it's enough? Will it ever be enough? The answer, like the man himself, remains elusive. But the families he freed, the lives they built, the descendants who carry their stories forward, they provide something like an answer, not enough to balance the scales of history, not enough to redeem the system that enslaved them, but enough to matter. Enough to prove that even ghosts can change the world, one family at a time. Enough to ensure that William Thorne, whatever he was, whoever he was, will never be completely forgotten. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions aren't meant to have answers. Some ghosts are meant to haunt us forever, reminding us that in the darkest moments of history, in the face of unimaginable evil, someone might choose to act. Someone might decide that complicity is no longer acceptable. Someone might burn their old life and become something new, something useful, something that matters. William Thorne became that someone. And then he disappeared, leaving us only with the echoes of his impossible mission and the persistent question, who was he really? And could we, if faced with similar circumstances, find the same courage to become ghosts ourselves?